And welcome, everyone. I am Nicholas. Today we have a very special webinar, a conversational fireside chat with a very special guest, Adam D'Orenzo. And we will look at securing wastewater with remote connectivity and with segmentation and employing zero trust. We'll do a little bit of housekeeping on the agenda in our intros, and then we'll dive into this conversation. I'll go into the topics at hand, and we'll even have an example, for example, discussion about the types of software, hardware, topologies, and the experience of deploying the Agillicus platform. So for today, we'll go and about and see who our participants are. Myself and Adam from McKim & Creed. We'll talk about operational technology. We'll look at the aspects of critical infrastructure and how IT and OT sort of intermingle in the networking landscape when it comes to cybersecurity. We'll look at important topics, and Adam will share his experience on providing remote access, preserving security, for example, through segmentation and industrial control systems. We'll talk about the rise and fall of VPNs, for example, the concept of identity and credentials, how we can keep audits running and have visibility into this to maintain compliance. And lastly, we'll talk about the end-to-end of what a water treatment facility in the wastewater space, for example, might look like with remote access, the type of equipment, the type of software, the advantages of using zero trust network access. So as we move along, without further ado, I'm Nicholas. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at Agillicus. And we have Adam D'Orenzo. Adam, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, my name is Adam D'Orenzo. I'm with McKim & Creed, and I've been working in the wastewater and water area for about 18 years. And I'm a new role here at McKim & Creed. I do the programming and integration for wastewater and water plants.
Perfect. And as the slide mentioned, ask us if you have any questions on topic while we power through the conversation today. Feel free to ask us in the chat. We'll gladly introduce the topics or questions as they come along into our conversation. If I see that the question might be related to a topic, we'll address it a little bit later in the order of topics. I'll certainly bring that at that time. So by all means, you're invited to participate, ask questions. Adam has a depth of experience with our platform as well. So that's the goal here that I have today, is just to grab some answers from Adam about what is the real end user experience when it comes to addressing the challenges in the wastewater and water treatment space with Agillicus. So let's jump ahead here and let's talk about key statistics in the water sector. There's over 150,000 public water systems in the United States. 90% of drinking water in the United States come from PWS, public water systems. And the vast majority of the population is served by this infrastructure. The fact that it employs a lot of legacy systems, the fact that it is also a critical part of infrastructure makes it the #1 fear in the industry for cyber threats. That means that ongoing amount of attacks is high. It is a very easy target. It has a 9-fold increase in cyber crime from 2018 to 2022. A lot of it is ransomware, for example, or compromising of credentials. It is a 20% share of all ransomware attacks in the United States, which is huge for a fairly narrow sector of critical infrastructure. So that speaks to the target of opportunity that it has become, and also that actors or bad actors are keenly aware of the impact that disruption of public water systems will have on general population, but also politically as a reputational risk for local governments. So when we talk about then providing access, managing these from an engineering perspective, Adam, I think is well suited here. Can you talk a little bit, Adam, about what would have been the challenges of maintaining these types of critical infrastructure? You're in the engineering side of it. This is probably your bread and butter. There's been an evolution here in keeping access secure into these types of facility. What have you seen in the landscape, like, since you started?
Well, right now, like a lot of municipalities have a problem between the IT and OT departments, and they tend to feud a lot. And so some municipalities, people might try to do some um, maybe not the safest practice to get remote access to vendors and so on. So having like this system made it a little easier to get remote access to the people.
So it's like the
And
age-old ITOT, right? It's I think it's permeates beyond public water utilities, that whenever it is an IT shop and an OT shop, very different objectives, right? One is, I think we'll look at that in the next slide, but it's a great point. Now, typically, what has been the efforts that when you move into a water systems, and I take it you deal mostly with OT space, is it always a challenge to get remote access? And you're talking about, employing maybe unsafe practices. I think this is a way of not circumventing, but going around maybe the established IT policy that might be too cumbersome or don't support the type of tooling that the OT networks requires.
Correct. We always try to go the IT route, work with your IT department, follow the best practice. But sometimes the budgets are kind of low in wastewater and water. So, you try to give them the best way to get remote access to the different application. It's 24 hours. They need access, and sometimes IT doesn't understand that what it means if a plant goes down.
Yeah, because
So
I think
traditionally, IT would give like a VPN. That's the traditional way of getting access.
right, and that typically can answer sort of the networking requirement to getting into the OT network. At the same time, I think the OT phenomenon of applying segmentation, like the Purdue model, for example, where you different industrial control zone, the VPN giving you network access that tend to be overly broad into the network, tends to sort of mess up your best practices that you're trying to maintain at a minimum in the OT space, to limit access to different parts of your OT network. But you mentioned something here, like the 24 hours. I think there's a huge priority typically in the OT space. It's uptime and service delivery. You want to have your capability always on, whereas IT is mostly, having your capabilities always up to date and secure. And I think that the meshing of those two diametrically opposed views tends to delay access into the OT network while preserving sort of the basic security that we try to have in the OT space. And I think that leads to the discussion here, the day-to-day challenges with industrial networks. We're talking about our industrial control zones. Some of the challenges that you probably see here, you come into a water treatment facility. Do you introduce vendors' equipment? Do the OT side impose or have restrictions on the types of vendors that you can bring in? And how do you then try to secure that networking equipment in the OT space and then request access to it? Is that a one-off that every water treatment facility is different, or do you guys have best practices on the type of software or hardware that you try to integrate into?
Well, we don't really care what product you use. We'll use any product that you offer, the customer wants. But, sometimes we have to, for instance, if they didn't have remote access, right, we have to do some research and figure out, hey, what's the need of the customer, and then how can we get the need fulfilled. So that's like, for instance, our one customer that we're kind of talking about, they didn't have an IT department really, so we needed some remote access for a project that we're doing, and this kind of fit in there.
So
And
you
it
come
allows
into
us to
different
secure
levels.
access.
Yeah, so you come into different levels. Sometimes they might even, like you mentioned in this instance, not have an IT department. So you're playing the role here of network architect, I think, in the OT space and trying to craft the remote access strategy that you're going to give. Sometimes we just discuss you have an IT department that can be helpful, or that can be a gate, I guess, to getting the right amount of access into that OT network. How often do you find yourself dealing with remote applications that are kind of older legacy systems, and then does that have an inherent risk from a security perspective if you try to expose or give remote access to that? Like, I assume not all of the systems have user accounts, for example. Let's talk about PLC programming and things like that. Uh, do you then become sort of responsible for ensuring the security if you're going to have the remote access system?
Well, for the most part, the municipality we're working with is managing the remote access system.
Okay.
We're just kind of using it. Now we can offer, we do help municipalities try to find, different solutions, but for the most part, uh, it's up to the utility or whatnot.
Okay. So you come into usually a framework of best practices or approved types of access. Let's go and talk about that type of access in the cybersecurity space, because we're talking about the ability to get remote access, which is not always a given. I think people assume that there's broadband or internet access everywhere in the continental U.S., but typically public water systems, wastewater systems have not been built in very densely populated area. They tend to be at the edge of town, where there might be either slow internet or no internet at all. And then we need to give access to that for specific projects. And then once we have access, as I mentioned, we want to maintain some isolation as to the types of resources that we have. So we've worked together, you and I, on this project here, and we've introduced the concept of zero trust, where we've given access to specific resources, maintaining, for example, access to PLC programming or web UIs or even the router interface. Tell me a little bit about the challenges of coming up with these types of solutions. Like in this case, I think we're backhauling over LTE. For you, as you go into a plan, you have to get to a site, you need remote access. How do you deal with this? You mentioned no IT. Do you talk to the local OT guys, figure out what internet solutions you can get, what type of hardware you can get, and then you have to design this? I guess that's part of the project delivery.
It depends on what kind of projects. On this one, we were in charge of putting all new PLCs and touchscreens and new SCADA platform on it. And one of our requirement was that due to the fact of where we're located and where the customer is located, remote access was needed. And the customer was supposed to provide access. Well, the municipality was feud with the IT department, and now they needed a solution to get remote access. Traditionally, I see just, hey, we can put a modem here, and you could just open VPN to the thing, and we can't do that to our customers, and putting them at risk if we're trying to help them architect a solution. So having that zero trust with this was a good solution.
And when you mentioned introducing zero trust, and you're absolutely right. Like sometimes I do site surveys and I get into sort of the data room, and there's a few modems hanging on the walls that nobody's aware of who they belong to and what they're doing. Do you, like, there's a question from Paul in the chat here, like, when you evaluated zero trust, was that part of a risk assessment, of understanding what's the worst case scenario that can happen if my devices get compromised, or if my router starts having open ports on the internet here? The zero trust concept is not necessarily brand new, and it's been existed for a while. It existed for a while, but what would you say were the drivers to going to zero trust versus, for example, you just said, oh, I'm not going to give a VPN here. I'm not going to do that to my customer. Was that the conclusion of after a risk assessment or analyzing the ROI of what a VPN solution might be?
Well, this is before risk assessment.
Okay.
We do offer risk assessments and go into real detail. We have a group that is in charge of that, cybersecurity.
Mhm.
But for this certain one, we didn't have a risk assessment. It was just like, how do we give the customer, how do we get access and also show the customer a solution that they can manage and um, you know provide the security that they need for the PLCs, not having full blown remote access.
Yeah, so that point, not having full-blown remote access, and you mentioned PLCs, for example. I think I touched on it earlier. How important is that? Like, do you have the desire or the mandate to internally or through the municipality really to not give full-fledged access? Do you need to control which part of your staff has access to which device, or the ability, the requirement, and we'll look at that a little bit later, to understand from an audit perspective of who's accessing what. I think historically, too often we have shared credentials, but is that something that was part of that assessment in selecting that type of product?
I have seen in the past where maybe a IT department gives a VPN certificate and credentials to somebody, a contractor, and that contractor could give it to somebody else in their job. With this, we can say, all right, we want to give you access to just you, and maybe they're only doing work on a certain PLC. So we don't want to give. I think you should always give the least amount of access to the product. So this allowed us to give, really tailor the solution and help out the customer.
Right, and well, let's look at that then, because from securing access, one of the first thing you mentioned here is sharing of those credentials. So the concept of identity management is big in the zero trust architecture. The idea that historically we've shared credentials, or we can't really prevent the sharing of those credentials when they're fairly static, or it's a new account in a VPN account. In Zero Trust or in the Agilicus platform, for example, we have the concept of identities. So it's not a username and password. It's Adam's email, Nick's email, your colleague's email. How how much of a relief is that when you've implemented either access, for example, to RS links, right? Do you want to program a PLC that doesn't have any concept of identity or user by itself? It's just a Windows application to program a PLC, but the ability now to know specifically, who was it that ran RS links? Who was it that specifically accessed this PLC? How much of a change is that, like, within your organization, to go to the customer and have the ability to tell them, I can audit at any given time who's accessing these resources, or even internally within your own compliance or governance frameworks?
Yeah, I mean it's a big thing because when I was in my previous job working in a municipality,
Mhm.
some contractors would access the system in the middle of the night, and since the IT department kind of pretty much managed it traditionally with a VPN, um, it was hard to figure out, did the guy actually get access, or like it was hard to audit. But now that with um, being able to audit the trail, who was logged in, what time, things like that, it gives you a little. If something did happen, you can kind of figure out, hey, what happened, what time.
Yep, yep, absolutely. And you mentioned something quickly, like, but the least amount of privileges dovetails on that, right? So you know exactly who it was, but also you've been able to control, and like you mentioned, the least amount of permissions for whatever task they needed to do in that time frame. When we look at what that means on the resource side, the least amount of privileges, we can combine that again, specifically in the Agilicus platform here, with a set of features that you've employed. One of them being, and we could go over those, but the outbound only connection. So the first one is not having to ask IT, for example, to punch a hole in the firewall, or even if you're going it on your own and deploying something like an LTE modem, having the ability to be completely firewalled off. There's no access into this system. The other one you just mentioned, enforcing least amount of privileges. You only get access to the SCADA system or the PLC or the HMI. The auditing we just talked about, but generally keeping everything off the internet. Of all of these 6 things, like which one I think brings you value, and in which one I think you feel are important in deploying into the site access?
I mean, I don't know if I can just say one thing because all those things are very important. So, just knowing what's going on.
Yeah. So
with
from
system.
the outbound connection, I think that becomes very simple, right? From a deployment perspective, you just install it, and if you have internet access, that's outbound. Like
Correct.
default, I think security behavior, it just connects and goes out to you. Have you had mandates or have you had requirements to not expose resources on the internet? I suppose I think historically a lot of the OT systems have been air gap, maintaining that there is no
Well,
direct access to the internet, or is that a little bit of a touchy discussion that needs to be had?
people say it's air gap, but then we know, just like you said earlier, about people hanging modems on right into the network switch. So, you know,
We always start with the best
traditionally, yeah.
intentions, and then it
Yeah.
drifts and drifts and drifts until
I need
they're
access,
yes,
right?
perfect.
The IT, I mean the plant workers, like this guy needs to, I got this machine down, I need this back up. How do that vendor gets access, right? And they say, hey, put this modem here, and now you're exposing yourself to the whole everything. So.
Yeah. Emergency and necessity, I think, tend to dilute what we call the security posture, right? We start with a very hermetic deployment, and over time, our exceptions tend to pile up, and we drift, and all of a sudden we find ourselves with a poor security posture or attack surfaces that pop up years later in audits. And I think having something that is out of the box, easy to use, that does not compromise the ease of access or the speed of access into these resources makes a huge difference in actually upholding that model over time. I think that's generally my observation has been, if you have the right model from the get-go that gives you that ease of access, you can get access to the specific resources. You don't need to move heaven and earth to enable that. And you have the right amount of permissions. You don't deviate from that. It's set, and then you don't end up with a security posture that drifts over time into a lack of protection and security. Do you see that in your usage day to day now of Agilicus? Do you find that these features are fairly well set, that you don't need to drift away from the model that you implement?
Oh yeah, we can, add new users. We can create groups. We can do all the traditional stuff, and then we can just say, "Hey, this guy needs that PLC access." Okay, or this client needs to view just the SCADA screen, or maybe it's some internal reports that needs to be sent out, or remote notifications. Some SCADA systems need remote access to send out email and text messages. So, this is a way to send out that information securely.
And that's a great point, because emails, SMS inbound or outbound, like Twilio integrations, for example, typically have been a sore spot, right? To punch a hole in the firewall to allow that API to come in, and having then the ability to segment that, front end it with a cloud-based endpoint, so that if there's ever a malicious actor, they're not really touching the back end here, as we have on the slide, of your SCADA system or that server to try to push notifications, for example. They're really hitting the cloud instead, and it gives it sort of the Cloudflare model of protection tooling. I think is a something that's not always observed. It's not sexy, but it's a huge improvement over the default. I'll punch a hole in my firewall so you can come on that port to receive texts and emails. That tends to make a big difference. You talk about deploying these things. Let's talk a little bit about that. Angelicus is a software-only solution, which is a little bit different, right? We're used typically to VPN concentrators or having a box or a modem. We deploy on typically existing hardware, anything that is a compute node across multiple target architectures, Intel, MIPS, ARM, for example. I'm showing a slide with a couple pieces of equipment, and I think you've used the majority of those, right?
Yeah, I think 3 out of the 4.
So we have, I think, the Moxa, which is a compute node, the 8200. I think you've used the Edge router, right? The Ubiquity box as well.
Correct.
I have one of those NanoPi at the bottom right there, which is fairly powerful, Linux-based, OpenWRT. In the example I think that we're discussing today, in the use cases or the featured customer, we'll call it, we've used a Cisco IR1101. Can you tell me a little bit more? Like, was that driven by you, driven by the customer? Was just an hardware of opportunity that you had? Was it based on the requirement for remote access types?
Well, it was just a piece of hardware that we had in our hands. And the nice thing with this, if a lot of municipalities are Cisco, so if the IT department was involved, right, they could take this device and manage it how they would like to. This one, the Cisco one, has a modem tied to it, which made it perfect for our solution because we didn't have a ISP provider. But yet, if they end up down the road getting some kind of ISP, we can leverage all the WAN connections on this device. And one thing that the customer kind of liked, and I didn't really think of it at first, but being that it's a modem and this is plugged into their switch, say if they were not comfortable with, always having that connection, they can teach the people, the plant operators, hey, if XYZ needs access, now you can just plug in this port. The connector could always stay up, but then that kind of adds maybe a little additional, kind of make them feel a little better.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you're saying you can sort of accelerate if they have an IT department with a procurement, if they have an existing vendor, in this case Cisco, right? They can go in a catalog and pick up that approved piece of equipment. In the deployment, you mentioned this one as an LTE modem, so it's fairly modular from the looks of it, right? You can do WAN port, you can do LTE, so you could do sort of a active failover type link if you ever had broadband come into the site. I think the NanoPi is the same thing, other than it didn't have an LTE modem.
Correct.
You used a little MiFi box external LTE modem to route into. Now, in the case here, one thing that I just wanted to point out is that even though Cisco is a router and that device acts as a router, we disabled the routing feature on this device, right? In that you have an LTE modem on one side for segmentation, you have the industrial control zone or the ICS, industrial control system, on the other. But there was no routing capability enabled in this device. There are two different bridge groups. The only service that was running on this was the connector in a container environment that allowed us to accept connectivity from the Angelicus cloud and then route out or give access on the local network to the PLC, for example, you mentioned. How important was that for you to have that complete separation, that you have a piece of equipment, but it does not route, it does not allow anything inside the network to go out to the internet, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it makes our life, because they have an infrastructure that's currently there, so we didn't need to add all those additional points in the system.
Yeah. So then you end up with a device that doesn't provide internet access to any of these equipment or resources in the secure network, right? It's simply used for
Correct.
this type of remote access. And you mentioned, for example, this has a WAN port, but typically, I guess you're open to integrating on LAN or Ethernet based connectivity or Wi-Fi or LTE. It doesn't really matter for you, I think, as a project owner to which way you deploy, as long as you can get internet access as quickly as you can get it. So having the choice of hardware at hand, I think, is a huge facilitator, I would assume, for your projects.
Correct. Then, let the customer decide what platform they go with, and this can be installed as a little add-on.
Perfect. When we look at the other side of the zero trust equation, and then we looked at the resources, the hardware devices where we can run the Agilicus software, the connector itself. When we look at the other side of the platform that you've been using, that uses the unified identity system, we talked about earlier, having shared credentials, being able to use your identity. In this case here, I've put our mugshots on the slide here to show that I can log in with my my ID or my email address. You can log in with yours. How much easier then does it become to manage the staff that needs to access? You don't no longer care really where that identity comes from. It can be federated by pretty much any system. But is there a simplicity here when someone wants to access, for example, RS links to program a PLC, that they don't need a VPN client, they just need to run this and show who they are? Does that over time simplify the way that you can share access to this site with your colleagues or third-party vendors, for example?
Correct. Yeah, it gives the customer a lot of flexibility of who to be able to add. And then it gives peace of mind that I'm not going to give my work credentials, my username and password to like Chris or somebody like that, so.
And one thing that comes up here is MFA, because we haven't really talked about that up until now. When we look at securing critical infrastructure, having an MFA with your identity provider, for example, we use G Suite here in the office. A lot of our customers use Office 365 that do have MFA, but you no longer have really the control of who gets to do MFA and when, but more specifically, using it for legacy application like internal websites, application, industrial application like Workbench or RS Links and Studio 5000. Does the ability now to have MFA in home base?
Schneider product too.
Yeah, exactly, right? With Schneider products, having the ability to use MFA on applications that otherwise would not have that capability. How much of a game changer is that? The ability to really have an audit of exactly who it was that came in, but the fact that you can implement MFA on any type of application.
I mean, that kind of takes it to the next level of securing and auditing the system, because a lot of the stuff is kind of open. All you need is you can connect directly to it. Being able to lock that down is a great feature.
And if you ever had to pass along your MFA token or tell someone what the SMS text code was, or have you you run into customers that sort of try to defeat the purpose of MFA? I've anecdotally had a customer who had one cell phone shared amongst 20 people, and so when the SMS code came in, they had to call each other to give the code, but it sort of defeats the purpose. But in your day-to-day, do you use MFA yourself? Like, do you employ it to access these resources?
I have. I mean, we use MFA, but I haven't deployed on recently on any of these little systems. But definitely will be first step is kind of getting people used to it, and then then we can kind of lock it down a lot more. So
And what's your preferred MFA? Is it the one-time password or the phone unlock, or what's your go-to MFA
I
for
do the
yourself?
I do the phone
The Google,
type of
okay, perfect. Yeah, I'm
authenticator or Microsoft.
yeah, I think that's typically the go-to is the either Google or Microsoft Authenticator for one-time password.
Mhm.
I like the Android integration, like just unlocking your phone as a factor to prove who you are on your account. I think is goes a long way. Um,
Mhm.
Sometimes the YubiKey, like the hardware key, also having to
I have
plug it
used
into
those with the
your
fingerprint.
exactly right. So those go a long way in improving security in for user identity and having the ability to audit that someone's not just using your username and password, but someone has that second factor in the audit really goes a long way in having what we call a non-repudiated record, that it was really you because you obviously own both of these factors, things you have and things you know, as they say. Uh, in the single sign-on, like one thing that comes up sometimes in my discussion is credential fatigue. So people either have too many passwords that you need to keep track. We talk about post-it notes inside of a screen, but also the ability to log in repeatedly or having to log in repeatedly into a lot of systems. Do you see that single sign-on is useful here, or what's your typical policy, either personal level or corporate level, when you do these programs? Do you allow people to do single sign-on across different levels or different sites or different resource on a site? Or what's your typical preference here?
I mean, it's up to the customer, but yes, I prefer single sign-on. It makes it. I get fatigued. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
perfect. So let's look here. No, I think we're running on the top of the time here. If there's any question for us on the webinar, I invite you to reach out to us. I'm Nicholas. You can reach me either at nick@agilicus.com. Adam, I think I didn't want to dox you and put your email address. So thanks for giving us the info at Mickey McCreed. Uh,
yes,
Anything you
that'll
want to
get you to the
say?
right.
Yep.
Yeah, just feel free to email it. We'll direct that to the right people if you need any assistance on any plants or cybersecurity. We have a team for that, and we can help you out with that programming things, engineering. Check out the website.
Perfect. Absolutely. Thanks everyone for joining us today. It's been a great discussion. Adam, thank you so much for doing this with me. It's a great conversation. I love our discussions. I hope we continue to have them. Thanks for taking the time today. Much appreciated. And to anyone, if you want to reach Adam, do so at McKim&Creed, McKimCreed.com. It's been a great partner of ours at Agilicus, and we look forward to continuing our interactions. Thanks, Adam.
Yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate it.